Hello, and welcome to the Movement Prescription Podcast. I'm Callum, and this week I'm delighted to have an interview with Andrew Telfer from WildStrong. WildStrong is an organisation that believes in movement, outside in nature, and in community. Andrew was a CrossFit instructor for 10 years in Thailand, before growing slightly disillusioned with the fitness industry and retraining in public health. Then with Jill, his wife, they set up WildStrong as an antidote to many of the woes that they saw in the fitness industry. In essence, this podcast is all about relationship with others, with nature, with movement. It's really thought-provoking for me, as it challenges a lot of my preconceived ideas around the fitness industry in a really positive way. I hope that you two are left with plenty to think about, feel challenged, and will reach out to Andrew, Jill, or even myself, whether that's through Instagram, comments on the thread, or any other kind of form of social media. With no further ado, I really hope you enjoy listening. Hi, Andrew. Could you tell us a bit about WildStrong and what you guys do there?
Yeah. WildStrong is an organization where we try to get people outside, moving with each other, trying to build social connections and sort of mutual support networks, but sort of sneaking it in through the guise of exercise. We don't really use the word exercise. We don't really use the word fitness. Sometimes we might say working out or something like that. But really the idea is, how can you get people outside, moving together, focusing on different skills? So, from the outside, you might say, well, it's an exercise organization, or they do outdoor group exercise, which is probably true. But it's not really how we think of it ourselves. What we really try to do is we try to focus on skill development. That's something we call the capabilities approach, which is, instead of getting people out doing lots of sets and reps of sort of abstract exercises, like instead of saying, look, I want you to do as many burpees as you can in an hour, we try to use that time to say, well, why don't we focus on some task-based skill development, like, can you climb over a log? Can you pick up a heavy object? Can you move something from A to B? And then can you sort of take these, instead of these abstract movements, can you sort of get these task-based practical movements that are useful for you, and can you incorporate them into your life so that you can start doing the things that you enjoy doing? Whether it's, if you have some friends who maybe have a football team, and they say, hey, do you want to come out and play football? So you have the confidence to feel like you can engage with that. If a new climbing wall opens up in town and people go, we want people to feel like they have the confidence to engage with that. So really what we try to do is we try to give people the tools so that they're confident to engage in the things that are meaningful for them. And that's why I talk about this idea of the capabilities approach, because it's sort of this way of expanding freedom, expanding people's options so that they feel like they can participate in everything that's around them. So not focusing on exercise for the sake of exercise, but this idea of building up the confidence and the social network and the support network that people need so they can do the things that they want to do.
Yeah, really interesting. And one of the things that I've come across recently in a few conversations, actually one with you previously, is the concept of physical literacy.
Yes.
And you shared that paper, which I'll share to the listeners. It was really interesting talking about, at school, we all have experience of those people that could do every sport quite well. They had those, like, they kind of nailed those core movements.
Yeah.
I suppose that's what you're kind of trying to teach people is there's a number of core movements, or just function of body through space, that we can then translate across a variety of.
Yeah. And it's interesting, because in our courses we talk a lot about how do you make sense of human movement? Do you know what I mean? Because it's such a complicated thing. And, so for example, if you're going to talk to a bodybuilder in the 1980s, he would talk about body part splits. You're going to do your bis and your tris, your back, your legs, whatever. And that was, the forest through the trees for them. That was their reality. That's kind of how they compartmentalized movement. Then in the mid 2000s, people started looking at functional movement patterns like hinges, squats, pushing, pulling, things like that. And then, you have some of the people who focus on the natural movement. So there are organizations that might look at things like, crawling, running, carrying, things like that, which is, in line sort of with what we do. But whenever you try to look at human movement, you try to fit it into, this set of skills or this set of positions or this set of body parts. Things are always going to fall through the cracks, which is one of the reasons why I kind of talk about this idea of task-based, which is becoming quite popular now, especially in training older adults, which is instead of this idea that if you go to the gym and work with a personal trainer and you do X amount of leg presses in the leg press machine, or, they teach you how to deadlift with a barbell, maybe that will translate over into better quality of life in the real world. Whereas what we try to do with the task-based stuff is you just try to get people to do the thing itself instead of an abstract version of it. And once you do that, it's actually really freeing because you just spend time doing fun activities. It means it opens up to things like playing games and, playing floor is lava, picking things up, running with them. And a lot of what we do is it's kind of based in this sort of ecological dynamic approach. Which is to say, instead of it being the coach's role or the trainer's role to say, this is the way that you do this, this is the ideal way to pick up an object, this is the ideal way to take an object and put it over your head or whatever. What we try to do is we try to provide an environment that allows people to experiment and sort of come up with their own movement solutions. And we really try to focus on this idea of self-organization. So going back to this idea of movement literacy, the reason I kind of went around when I said that is because people have been talking about movement literacy for a long time. I think the term has been used since at least maybe 1991. I want to say maybe Whitehead is the first person to coin it, but don't quote me on that. Yeah. But, people have really been talking about it. And over this time, this conversation, it's sort of become more or less expansive where people say, well, movement literacy is these 4 movements or these basic functional motor skills and things like that. But you're right. We've all met people who just do this sort of beautifully. Even with my 2 children, who I love dearly, one of them picks up motor skills and movements much more easily, and one of them has to think about it. And that's how I was when I was younger too. My brother moved beautifully, and he could pick up any movement. He was always the best at his sport, where like I was never great at that. And I think I kind of created this narrative for myself where I said, I'm not good at this, so I'm not going to do it. So I cut off my opportunities to engage with these sorts of things. And it wasn't until I really got older, and then getting into fitness and personal training and things like that, where I got back into it. And I got into personal training, I got into sports and conditioning and doing your squats and your deadlifts. And I was a CrossFit coach for 10 years. And I got very good at these specific prescribed movements. I got, my Olympic lifting was never great, but it was pretty good. My squats were heavy. My deadlifts were heavy. And in the context of being in the CrossFit box, I felt very confident. Like, I know that if I'm doing a workout and these X movements come through, I know that I can do them well and sort of present myself as capable. But then all of a sudden, when I was in the real world, I realized that like I still had all these sort of hangups with doing things. And there's certain movements and positions that I avoided. There were things that were quite awkward, basic things like being able to get up and down from the ground fluidly. Sitting in a low chair. These are all things that I was like still oddly bad at, or like, just things like skipping and running and sort of, anytime I was in kind of a playful environment where I had to do something that was off script, I noticed that I still wasn't very good at it. I was still that same kid. So I started looking at it from that perspective instead of thinking, well, how, instead of doing the repetitions of these exercises over and over and over again, how do we actually just get people to start engaging with the environment around them in a way that's like social and meaningful and fun?
There's a couple of things I want to pick up there, but one just immediately from that, it is, I think one of like our needs as humans is to be capable at things. Mm-hmm. So we kind of only focus on things that we need to be good at things, and we need that gives us inherent value, and actually, I think we often avoid the things that we don't feel good at, or we don't feel we can do well. And so, for you, I can understand why in CrossFit, and we'll come hopefully talk a bit about CrossFit very shortly, but CrossFit's a really controlled environment. And we like knowing, or a lot of us like that control. We like knowing that actually we're not going to get surprised, or left field things aren't going to happen. It's slightly unnatural as a consequence because it's so controlled. Yeah. But how do we persuade people that actually the surprise, the kind of uncontrol is inherently human, but also it can be a lot of fun. How do we persuade people? And I suppose maybe you can relate that to your own journey. How did you come from actually going from a controlled space to actually thinking, gosh,
Yeah,
I want to embrace
that's a really good point. I wrote down a few points. One of the things I was thinking about is, this is kind of separate, but this idea of surprise. When people talk about anxiety nowadays, and sort of generally how anxious people are, one of the things they talk about is people's tolerance for ambiguity.
Mm-hmm.
And generally, people, I think we are raised to not like ambiguity. I think especially if you grow up, having gone to school, sort of grown up in the context of big organizations, school, university, work, whatever. A big part of that is kind of creating SOPs or sort of creating rules or standards, kind of putting everything into a grid, quantifying everything. Because once you attach a number to something, you sort of feel quite good. You feel like that's safe. Okay, I've given that a value. And I don't think that we have much opportunity growing up to kind of build up, a tolerance for ambiguity. And that's sort of what play is. Play is all about dealing with ambiguity, whether it's physical play or risky play or even like roughhousing, even just like conversation is play, kind of knowing when to push something, when not to, when to make a joke. It's that level of ambiguity that when you try to take that ambiguity and you try to systematize it, that's when things become in trouble. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think people, hopefully listeners, will really be able to associate that, because I know a lot are healthcare professionals. And one of the biggest challenges we have, particularly I find in primary care, is dealing with ambiguity.
Yes.
It's really nice to have black and whites, but actually, nothing really is black and white. And so you're dealing with degrees and levels of ambiguity, and you have to kind of come to a plan or a decision with a patient and acknowledging that ambiguity exists. And actually, it's much easier if it's just like a systematic flow chart or something that you just follow.
That's it. And this may be a conversation for a different day. But, big organizations, there's lots of reasons why we develop SOPs, because obviously it's going to have best outcome. And again, it's easier to quantify. It's obviously easier to design studies to sort of quantify the benefit of a certain thing over another, which is really valid and obviously, very important. But then in complex systems, they also develop accountability sinks, which is, essentially when you create a system that sort of ensures that people actually don't need to be in a position where they have to make that decision because they don't want to get in trouble, which is understandable. Nobody wants to get sued. You don't want an inquiry if you make the wrong decision. But it also means that sometimes people sort of aren't able to use their experience and expertise to make a decision that they think is better. And that's a double-edged sword, because I think in a lot of cases, I think that having the sort of data and the information to kind of back up, these procedures is probably a good thing. But then sometimes it does squeeze things out. I guess going back to what you were saying about people being comfortable with certain things, it does create a feedback loop in terms of people avoiding what they're not good at. And this is sort of the ambiguity thing. Like, how do you get people in a position where they can enjoy that process of learning? And I think especially as we become adults, we don't allow ourselves to be in positions where we feel like a beginner again, or we feel like a learner, especially once we've hit that point where we feel like we're an expert or a voice of authority or somebody to be respected in a certain sphere. It's very hard for us to pull back and kind of put ourselves in a position where we're not good at something. And I think that a big part of that is creating a space where people feel like they can play and feel like they can learn, and not feel like everything is a failure if they don't do it. We spend a lot of time on things like falling and stumbling and getting people comfortable with this idea that, not everything is going to be perfect. So let's kind of create lots of opportunities and contingencies if you do slip, if you do fall, and like letting people know it's okay. And also that's where you grow. When we do a lot of work with older adults, and one of the first things I do is I'll do some balance work at the very beginning, up to the point where people start to stumble, because I want them to know it's like, guys, that's good. The stumbling is where you learn. If every single repetition or every single attempt look perfect, it means that you're not learning, So I try to get that out of the way as quickly as possible, and to create a kind of environment where people are comfortable with that struggle, with that growth, and then, not see it as failure, but see it as like an opportunity to play around in different areas.
Yeah, a really interesting point that we need to know where our boundaries are to be able to push them further. I think that is really interesting, kind of when you talk about play. And I think we embrace levels of ambiguity or uncertainty because we it's quite unpredictable what's going to happen. But in so doing, we often learn things about ourselves and our ability to move. And one of the things I enjoyed in kind of some of the things that you shared just before this podcast was about parkour. And actually, when you learn new movements and possibly embrace the ambiguity of those movements, you begin to see the world in a different way. Almost the world becomes a playground. And I think that's particularly relevant with something like parkour, because you look at street lights as things to climb as opposed to things to offer light, or you look at walls as obstacles to get over as opposed to boundaries or barriers. And so as we embrace ambiguity and possibly learn new movements, we also kind of change the way we see the world.
Yeah. This is a big thing. When I sort of learned this concept, so they talk about this idea of parkour vision, which is that once you start to realize that you can engage with the environment around you with ways that it wasn't designed, like, you can climb on a wall, you can jump over a railing or whatever, then all of a sudden you see these opportunities. And I should point out that I'm not a parkour guy. What I mean is, like, what we practice is not really parkour, but on the other hand, everything is kind of parkour, because parkour is just engaging with your environment. But like, one of the things, if you ever see me on a video, is I'm not particularly impressive, anything. Like, I do fine, I can like pick up heavy weight and I can jump over a wall, but I don't do anything particularly beautifully. But I because I'm always kind of playing around with different areas where I am kind of learning. So I don't want to present myself as a parkour, master, but I think that parkour, really got to some truths and made a lot of things visible that weren't in the fitness industry. Because so much of the fitness industry, there's the assumption that you're in a gym and you're going to use special equipment. And when you use the special equipment, you use it in a certain way. This is how you do a deadlift. And I think we talked about this the other day, but this is good form for a deadlift. Why is it good form for a deadlift? Well, because the bar is made of high tensile steel and it's 28 millimeters and it's 2.2 meters long. And when it sits, if you use Olympic weights, it sits 9 inches off the ground. So this is the good form for a deadlift. But obviously, if you're not using that special bit of equipment, if all of a sudden you're picking up a rock or a sandbag or you're trying to move a log, then the form changes. And I think sometimes in the fitness industry, people think that this is universally good form, or actually, sometimes what it is like, this is the most effective way to solve this problem, usually in the context of a sport as well, usually in the context of powerlifting, or usually in the context of CrossFit, usually in the context of Olympic lifting, which actually might not be true in everyday life. But what I wanted to say with parkour is, there's this concept of affordances, which is a big part of ecological dynamics. And it's sort of this idea that we have this kind of perception action coupling. And what that means is, your own abilities and your own sort of embodied physical reality will dictate what's visible to you. And there's different levels of this. You can really take that literally, or you can kind of have a loose version, but just like different examples. So like, there are some older people in my life, who have hip issues. And then when they walk into a room, if there's just a bunch of low sofas around, like some futons and things like that, they won't even engage with the sofa, because they know that the act of getting in and out of the sofa will be awkward. So they'll lean against the wall. And then you might see that as well, like men who have hip issues or knee issues later in life. If they're looking around for options to get up somewhere, they won't even look at like a high incline. They'll see, it's like, I'm not even going to pay attention to that hill. That's sort of cut off to me. Or other examples are like, pregnant women are very good at navigating narrow spaces, and they have a very good sense of a space that they can navigate, and they can't. Children, because they're small, they have a good sense of what they can hide in. So the way they look at the environment is dictated by their physical capacity and capabilities.
And maybe in a kind of positive way, as we become more functional and aware of our capacity, we can view things as opportunities.
Exactly.
And maybe an example this morning was it's about a 50-minute commute for me to get into the university, and I try and now see it as an opportunity for some form of exercise. Yes. So usually I choose whether I'm going to cycle, and I'll cycle in, or I'll drive halfway and run the last bit. Yes. So I ran the last kind of 7K, and the joy of that is that also, the last 7K is the bit where there's the most traffic, so it cuts out that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I suppose, and maybe you're going to get to that with the the parkour, the way that we see the world, our physical functioning dictates our decision making.
Yeah, exactly right. So that perception action coupling, this idea of affordances. So that affordances are sort of environmental features that invite you to engage with them in different ways. And if if you sort of feel like you're not capable, like you're able to do this because you know that you can run, So the idea of you running the last few miles every day is an option you don't even have to think about. It's a capability that you have. So you're like, of course that's open to me.
Yeah.
But if you can't run, that's cut off from you, just today when I was coming up from the train station, I ran up the stairs because as a point, I ran up the stairs, and I was able to avoid the line and the escalators. That was open to me because I know I don't have knee pain. I don't have any fear. I'm not afraid of, getting winded from walking up a few flights of stairs. But it's true in all sorts of things, if your strength is limited, you're not going to even try to pick up, let's say you're doing some gardening. You're not even going to try to pick up that bag of potting soil. It's cut off from you. So if you think of like a series of concentric circles, if your life, if you kind of contract and you get to this point where you don't feel like you can engage with the environment around you, you don't have options. Maybe you don't feel like you could go on walking groups with your friends. Maybe you don't feel like you can engage with anything. Maybe you can't play with your grandchildren because you don't feel like you can get down to the ground. And the thing is that, our lives are sort of the world around us kind of gets smaller. We were talking about just recently having kids, and your life kind of contracts when you have kids because you sort of focus on these one or two things around you, and maybe you don't listen to cool music anymore. Or you don't keep up with the latest movies. And then once you get out of that baby hole, it sort of expands again. But for some people, as they get older, because maybe they don't have as big a social network anymore, they don't have opportunity to play sports, they don't, maybe like their environment just doesn't really give them the opportunity to do things. They'll stop engaging with these activities, and then it becomes harder to start. So you've probably seen, the classic fear of falling cycle or the pain avoidance cycles, which are two sort of these feedback loops.
I think another thing that we see a lot is people, get to mid-70s, and they decide to move into a bungalow. And leave the stairs, and they do themselves a great example. Service.
Yeah.
Right? They suddenly become weak. They can't climb stairs or defunction as a consequence.
Yes. And the story I always talk about is my grandmother, who up to a certain age, I was like, wow, she's so nimble for her age. She's so active. And she went on this dog walk every day. She had a dog, and she walked through the woods, and in the woods, she had to get over a log to get through the river and all these things. She did quite a big, and then the dog died, and she just aged overnight because, in a way, the dog was almost an affordance. It was sort of an invitation for her to go out and, engage with the rest of the world. And it's all these little things. And that's why built environment and social networks are so important, because there are these opportunities to engage with the world around you. And if you don't, you start to lose that ability to engage.
Yeah. It's really interesting. The dogs not only make you go for a walk, but if you go for a walk with a dog, people come and say hello.
Yeah,
same for the kids.
Exactly.
Suddenly people want to. It's an ability. It's a vector for social.
Exactly.
Engagement.
And that's sort of it. And that's, you hit the nail on the head. That's the question: is how do we try to build in more of these vectors for social engagement and physical engagement? Because that is so much dictated by the environment, and that's why parkour is so interesting.
Yeah,
because they were given quite a limited environment. It's like you would say, well, the original Trasaurus didn't have green space or whatever, and they found a way to engage with the environment in sort of unexpected ways.
Yeah.
And that is really amazing. But then, the other side of that is most of the original parkour athletes. And even today, I think it's still a very male dominated sport.
Yeah.
Young, men without kids. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. So parkour is great, but it's as an intervention, you can't have everyone do parkour, at least not as people imagine parkour, which is that sort of extreme version.
Yeah. I think just stepping back, parkour is too extreme for me, but it's the gamification of the environment we live in that I quite enjoy. And I think how do we almost make fun and enjoy the spaces that we have? And
I think
I'm not great at it, but sometimes I have these like flashes of inspiration. And recently I was getting a train back from London, and it stopped in Haymarket. It stopped in Waverley.
Yeah.
And I had a 15-minute stop on Waverley, and then went from Haymarket. And I thought, oh gosh, I wonder if I can run from Waverley to Haymarket and jump back on my same train, which I fortunately did. But otherwise it might have been an expensive mistake. But I don't know if you have any thoughts on how we gamify or that, I suppose it's the joy of movement, the playful nature of things that we often lose as we get older, I think.
So, you said a few things there. I underlined gamification when you were talking about, because I was thinking about the difference between gamification and play. And gamification is one of those sort of hot button words, you know what I mean? Because I think some people hear it and they sort of don't like it, I think, because you've seen so much of this idea of gamification incorporated into like social media or freemium games on, whatever mobile phones and things like that. The idea of like, oh, you've played 3 days in a row, you get a gold star, that kind of thing. But, so with gamification, sometimes I'm worried about the idea of gamification and sportification as well, which is turning all physical activity into sports. And I think that would be a good conversation for a different day, because I think that you asked a really good question, like how do we incorporate play into our lives? And, you won't see it now, but in a few years, when you've got a toddler or even just past a toddler, I think like you really see it around the age of 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's amazing to see how kids engage with the world around them, because they turn everything into a game, because nothing's quite the right size for them anyway. So it's like very easy for them to hide and climb on things. So that's how they engage with the environment. Jill, my wife and partner, is very good at this. Whenever we go on dog walks, she always makes challenges, so a big one, and kids again do this all the time, turns thing into floor is lava, or like don't step on the crack. Things like that are really effective. And also just kind of setting challenges for yourself as well. So when you go on a walk, just hanging on a tree, trying to climb a tree, things like that. But I guess the tough thing, and this is what always comes back to for, I guess, the fitness industry, which I'm using as a shorthand, is so much of what we do, we assume we have to do it by ourselves. It's very hard to play games by yourself. But all of a sudden, if you bring someone else in, if you have a friend or a family member or a group of friends, then all of a sudden the games can sort of happen spontaneously. Because so many of the ways we think of games now are like, I'm going to do this and I'm going to set a challenge for myself, which is fun and rewarding. But it's like we were talking about off mic. Not everyone is wired that way. Not everyone is wired in such a way so that they like setting the challenges and meeting the challenges. Not everybody likes to see their back squat go up 2%. Not everybody thinks of the SMART goals and things like that. Same way that not everybody likes doing a really hard workout where they push themselves, because all of that sort of, I think, requires an element of willpower, which, it's like people always talk about in health promotion. In a way, you have to make the healthy option the easy option, How do you take these things and how do you embed them, socially, so that you're doing this sort of social movement, you're doing this movement with people? And that, I think, is the interesting thing.
I think that's such a crucial point. I'm so glad we got there. Is community, and I know at WildStrong that is at the core of what you do. And actually, community is possibly one of the most important pillars of lifestyle medicine. Being with others, and they're sort of defining of our identity and what we do. Your personal journey is a really interesting one, and having gone from being a CrossFit instructor for 10 years, and I know we briefly talked previously about CrossFit, and there's a lot we can learn. And then also take those concepts, but totally flip them. And, I wonder if you just kind of tell us a bit about that, and particularly, CrossFit, it's slightly kind of, masochistic in some ways in terms of its approach. It's also quite exclusive. And how do you create an environment or seek to create an environment at WildStrong, which is the exact opposite, which is an inclusive environment that has the same kind of appeal of community that CrossFit does?
So that's a good question. And, I think CrossFit has been so important for this conversation, because CrossFit, again, it's another of those things, a bit like parkour. It kind of allowed people to check their prior assumptions about movement and physicality and things like that. And I think with CrossFit, you really have to look at when it emerged. It kind of emerged right around 2000. It kind of came as a reaction against the way gyms were in 2000, where there's a big emphasis on using machines, and, sort of going back to that body part split, that sort of bodybuilding inspired way of looking at the world, of segmenting your body. When CrossFit came along, they said, well, let's not look at individual body parts. Let's look at movement. And it was a reaction against gym culture. But what's interesting about it is, even though it was a reaction against gym culture, it was still within the context of the gym. A CrossFit gym is called a box. You were literally working within a box. And, I think because CrossFit started off with this huge emphasis and still has this emphasis on quantification, how many sets and reps can you do in X amount of time? How much power can you produce? Which again is a really valid way of looking at things. But it means that it has to be a closed system. What I mean is you have to say, all right, we're going to do X amount of squats in whatever in a minute, Well, what is a squat? Well, we have to define what a squat is. We have to say, we have to develop points of performance. So feet roughly shoulder width apart, straight back, bring your hips down and back until your hip crease is below your knees. Make sure your knees don't go valgus. You have all these things. And I guess the next question is like, well, why? Why is that a squat? And is a squat even a real thing? What is a squat? And there is no such thing as a squat. There are squats. There are different positions where you might use something that looks like a squat. You could have a resting squat, that you still see in a lot of like global South cultures. You might have like an active athletic squat that you might use. You might have a position that looks like a squat when you're getting ready to jump really high or something like that. But there is no one universal squat. And really what it is kind of, it's sort of an organization of the various joints in your body to get a task done. And I don't want to get too much in the weeds on this. But it's one of the things that we've tried to get away from is to say like, look, there's an idealized way to do something. But really what we do is we try to look at this idea of presenting movement problems and allowing people to come up with movement solutions. So how do you get this heavy thing from A to B? How do you get this heavy thing down low to up high? And sometimes that might look like us saying, we want you to do squats. And sometimes you just want to get the job done. With CrossFit, I think because it came out of gym culture and they were trying to situate themselves as something different from gym culture, one of the things that was really important is showing that what they did was better and more extreme. So when Greg Glassman he was first trying to popularize CrossFit in California, he would go around and he would do challenges to like police departments and fire departments where he would get some of his small female CrossFit athletes and say, okay, we're going to do whatever. We're going to see how long it takes you to do 30 snatches with whatever, a 90-pound barbell. And you'd see these small women come in and absolutely dominate these guys because they had built this sort of, capacity to do that kind of work. And it was very impressive. And because of that, you kind of have this founder effect in CrossFit where, it's always been associated or tried to associate itself with military, special forces, first responders, things like that. And the original tagline was forging elite fitness, this idea of elitism, like we're talking about, which is automatically exclusive. But, the problem with CrossFit, in my eyes, not an absolute problem with CrossFit. The reason I don't think it's appropriate for a lot of people is because, you've got this idea of being elite. You've got this idea of turning everything to a sport and a competition, but a very narrow competition, which is how much work can you do in X amount of time. You have these very specific movements that need to be codified so you can turn it into a competition in the CrossFit Games or whatever. And it has this air of being more elite, more hardcore. And obviously that's not going to, appeal to everybody. It also falls into a lot of the pitfalls of exercise classes where it's this assumption of a top-down hierarchy where you have the coach at the top. The coach is the font of all knowledge. The coach is what tells you this is good form, this is bad form, this is a good movement, this is a bad movement, this is what we're doing today. And I'm going to tell you what's good and what's bad. And what we try to do a lot at WildStrong is we try to break that up. We try to do a lot more peer coaching. Instead of saying this is the one way to do something, we try to give people space to figure out solutions that work for them. If you've had 2 knee surgeries, there's a very good chance that doing like a deep squat as your main way of getting up and down might not be appropriate, but there might be other solutions that allow you to get the task done. There's nothing magical about focusing on the squat specifically. You need to find tools, that work, that works for you. And I guess, a lot of that also comes down to, just really questioning the idea of top-down systems and trying to get away from this idea of service or providing something for somebody. And that's kind of a weird point. But what we try to do is we try to generate this sense of reciprocity in our communities to make sure that everyone can kind of bring something and everybody can kind of help. So the peer coaching is really important because people feel important and useful because they can help other people learn and get better. But it also means that over time, we try to get it so that instead of the coach saying, these are the class times, other people in the community can say, hey, you know what? I would really like to have a class at 9:00 in the morning on Fridays because a lot of my friends, don't work on Fridays. Could we do that? And then is there a way that you can get the people in the community to start organizing and running the classes so it feels like it's a part of the community and getting other people to come in and start coaching as opposed to just saying, this is what's on offer at this gym?
Individual value is so interesting. And I think in a culture or a fitness culture, you have the person at the top who's fit, tells people how to perform, and that person with the double knee replacement would be at the other end of the spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
But in the WildStrong culture, they add something because they show other people that there's a different way of performing the task, the different movement to get that done, and everyone can learn from that.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. Yeah.
And it forces you to question things as well, because it means you can't come into sessions saying, this is the workout for today. This is what everybody has to do. We have to do these movements because they might not be appropriate for people. And, so I've got a pertinent example. Last week, we were doing we were starting a new cycle of our older adults class. And whenever I run a warm up, I try to keep it quite light and playful and just see how people are doing. And everyone's moving quite well. So I'm like, okay, this is quite a high, capability class. And then I was going to get people down on their hands and knees to start doing some sort of bird dogs and maybe working towards crawl and something like that. And two of the people in the class were like, I can't get down to the ground. And it's something that I was kind of prepared for, but I hadn't, based on how everyone was moving, I didn't think it was be an issue because everyone had quite good balance. It was an active group. They do a lot of wild swimming together. And there were two people who just couldn't get down to the ground, and it wasn't even like in a specific way. And part of that was because they had a fear of getting down to the ground. Part of it was one of them actually had knee replacements. One of them was just, afraid of pain. So part of it was pain avoidance. Part of it was embarrassment because they could get down to the ground, but not gracefully. They did it in a way where when they got down, you could see that they kind of lost control for a little bit, which was quite scary. And that forced me to think about my priors, because what I had planned for next week was we were going to start doing sort of challenging get up and get down variations, like, holding a kettlebell, holding a sandbag, things like that. But actually I realized what they need is they need the space where they just need space to experiment with getting up and down from the ground with different ways that worked for them. So, we set up an activity where we had a series of boxes and logs and tires around, things of different heights. We have sticks around, we have some ropes. And I just gave people time as partners just to play around with different ways of getting up. Because obviously the way that they think they need to get up and down doesn't work. So how can we start building up the capacity of that? And it ended up being a really interesting session because people were working with each other, people were making suggestions, and people found solutions that worked for them. Whereas I think if I were in a CrossFit environment, I could try to do a few substitutions here and there, but eventually I know that person would stop coming because there wasn't space for them. And then you would kind of have, there's this inherent bias in any kind of system like CrossFit. You have this survivorship bias where people are just going to kind of disappear over time. The people that CrossFit is a good match for will stay and they'll do really well on it, But what about all the people, who aren't an appropriate match for that style of training? You don't really see them. So you can just kind of look at the successes, but as is so often in this kind of thing, you don't see the people who aren't there. You don't see the negative case.
There's three things that kind of strike me. We've been talking a bit about kind of joy of movement, and what WildStrong seem to be doing is a culture of learning, a community of inclusivity, where everyone has inherent value and brings value to that community. And the third, and correct me if I'm wrong, it seems that it's not an outcome-based, it's basically not an outcome-based organization, but it's a process-based. So it's not about doing X number of squats or doing a 10K, but it's about being present and enjoying that movement, learning in those movements. And so much of the fitness industry is outcome based, and whether that is losing weight, lifting a certain number, doing something at a certain time, to just kind of just being present and does that kind of sum up WildStrong?
I think I really like all the points you made. So definitely we try to focus on this culture of learning and letting people know learning is part of the process, and not. Even with our coaches, we try not to put our coaches in a position where they feel like they have to be the font of all knowledge or they have to be perfect at everything. We want people to see, like whoever's running the class, we want to see that this learning is bi-directional. And, if you see somebody doing something like an interesting or perhaps a better way as a coach, that you can learn and say, hey, that's really good. I haven't seen that before. I'm going to use that. So people see that everyone's learning. Definitely inclusivity, making people feel like they're included. And it's one of the things we talked about before. Every sort of WildStrong community is going to have a sort of a different culture inevitably. So there are going to be some that maybe focus more on, competition, because that's sort of what the community supports. there are going to be some that are naturally more laid back. It's always going to be a reflection of the founding coach and the people that kind of come. But we really do try to be inclusive and try to make sure that everyone gets something meaningful out of it. The outcome-based and process-based sort of distinction is interesting because it kind of falls down to metrics, and it's I think we probably talked about this before, like, in organizational theory and in economics, we always have these ideas of, maybe externalities, or maybe a better one is like Goodhart's law, which is like the moment, you start measuring something, maybe it starts becoming a bad metric because people will kind of game the system. And I guess the other aspect of that is the way that we use metrics is contingent upon the tools that you have, if you can measure something. So like if, the granularity of outcomes is sort of based on whatever tools you're using, so like, sort of like, there's that classic example where like, if you were like a cartographer or whatever, a surveyor, and you were trying to measure a coastline, you would get radically different results in the length of the coastline, depending on how long your measuring implement is. Because if you have an implement that's like 100 meters long or something, that's obviously ridiculous. You're not going to get all the little nooks and crannies of the coastline. But if you were trying to measure the same thing with, say, like a ruler, which is obviously ridiculous, that was like, a foot long, then the quality of your metrics is going to be very different. And this is kind of roundabout way of saying that, like, I think we are outcome based and process based, but the issue is that it's not easy to make those outcomes legible in a quantifiable way, because we're measuring things like quality of life and engagement. So like, the outcome would be like, oh, what'd you do this weekend? Oh, someone invited me to go walk up a Monroe and I wouldn't have done that. So that is qualitative, obviously because it's a story. But I think if you did want to quantify, I think if you're going to look around that sphere where there's an active WildStrong, I think you'd see that the sort of social and like physical activity level of the group probably goes up, not just through the WildStrong, but engaging in things around them. But it's so hard to measure. Where do you get the data from that?
I spent half my week doing research, and I find this question of value really interesting. And I think culturally we value quantitative things. We value numbers and uplift in numbers. And there's a huge economic part in that as well. But actually, I'm passionate about needing a shift away from the quantitative to the qualitative, and quality of life and perceptions and experience as well. Because I think quantitative is so reductionist.
And it's an important tool. Like obviously it's such an important tool and we know it is, but the pendulum always sort of goes back and forth. And I think we've kind of hit this point where there's this obsession with datafication and turning everything to data and making these numbers legible. And again, I keep on saying we're losing the forest through the trees sometimes because, there's this huge appetite for creating data for things, but data is only as good as the questions being asked, and it's one of those things. And it's, I think a classic example is obviously, if we're looking at the hierarchy of evidence, when we're talking about evidence-based practice and we're saying, well, okay, maybe the top is meta-analyses or something like that. But if you start going down to, to double-blind studies and things like that, the information they get out, there are certain interventions that are a better match for the kind of data and evidence that we need. What I mean is it's much easier to do like a sort of classic study on a pharmaceutical intervention because it's very easy to make the control group and make the placebo. It's very easy to say, did you get the pill? Yes or no? What was the dosage of the pill? And in public health and things like that, we always have to use observational studies because we can't, we're sort of limited in the tools that we have. So when we try to make sense of the world in a certain way, it's also going to reduce our options, or I guess another way of looking at that is it's going to kind of dictate what kind of solutions we're looking for based on the tools that we have. It's very much like if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. It's that sort of thing where we keep on trying to find the same solutions because we're using the same tools to ask questions.
I'm aware of the time and we kind of like to pull this to a close. I think just from that, there's a couple of things that strike me. One is trying to kind of shift culture at a societal level, and it's trying to almost change what we value, and understand that there's a lot more to movement than data. And I think maybe that's another conversation is how we use our garment and I love this. I love the inclusivity of culture and how we, particularly, one thing I think with having a young kid and amazing parents is what kind of intergenerational movement and these kind of cultures of inclusivity look like, and how we move there. Do you know, I think a lot of what we've said is, we're not anti-CrossFit, and we discussed that. We both still quite like kind of and finding our limits, pushing our boundaries, and exactly. there's a space and there's a time for that. But for a lot of people, that is so far from tangible and realistic for them. We need space and time for everyone. And I suppose that is a poor summary of my final thoughts. I'm not sure if you want to kind of have a bash at summarizing.
It's tough because in our courses we do this thing where we try to show examples of different kind of movement, and through we use paper and posters now instead of I've tried to use slides as a little bit as possible. When I first started, I kind of fell into that trap of showing like a lot of sort of traditional movements. So maybe someone in East Africa, holding a resting squat position while they're cooking food, or like maybe some hunters, carrying something, almost kind of falling into a lot of the noble savage tropes of, back in the day, people used to move so much, whatever. And I was trying to show how movement was embedded into people's everyday life. But then I realized we still have examples of that, So you can look at different festivals that people do. You can look at people dancing, Scottish country dancing. Amish have lots of interesting examples with the barn raising and everything. What I'm saying though, is all this movement was embedded in people's life. Again, when I use the idea of social movement, it's so, and I understand why we did, but it's so weird. The solution we came up with was that I am going to put on my special clothes. I'm going to drive to the special place, the gym. I'm going to put in my headphones. I'm going to use the special machine for X amount of time. And that's how I'm going to get my physical activity. And I understand why we do that, because we don't have as many opportunities as we would like. But the question is, how do we sort of, we're doing all this decontextualized movement. How do we bring it back into people's lives? So it's not the special thing you have to do again because of willpower, where you have to go and, do your hour or two of working out 3 or 4 times a week. How do you actually make it so it's something that people can do that's part of their lives? And that's kind of the balance. You think about all these social clubs and groups that people used to be engaged with, whether it's things like the church or Elks Club or Rotary Club or whatever, or just, coming any kind of way that the community could come together, maybe even just things like harvest festivals, whatever. The community used to come together and sort of celebrate movement, whether it was through playing giant village-wide games of football or dancing or things like that. How do we set that up again? How do we start at a local level, start making these touch points so people can, engage with each other in a way that's physical and social, instead of just taking all that energy and exercising it, in a special place where it just sort of gets burned off into the ether.
I think that's a great place to end, because with a lot of the listeners being primary care professionals, they live and work in communities, and they're huge advocates or have the potential to be huge advocates for that. And I'm not saying, and again, this is something we've discussed previously. I'm not necessarily saying that the practice should be delivering these things, but I think that people that work within the practice can be advocates for them happening in their community, and have a real role to play in that, and can they can be the baton carriers, and conscious of what we discussed previously about not trying to medicalize movement. That's not something that we want to do, but aware of that role.
Yeah, and I guess I should say, I'd be remiss not to talk about it, is one of the things I'm sort of, I know we want to wrap up, is sometimes the fear of sort of being a hypocrite. What I mean is I get up every morning at 5 o'clock and I do a classic sort of gym workout, because that's what I grew up doing and it's meaningful for me. And like I said, it's time for me to kind of think about things. And a lot of what we do at WildStrong, traditionally when we started it, it was a private organization, which meant that even though we've kept prices quite low, and it means we're not beholden to funding cycles and things like that, it means that there is this element of exclusivity. You need to have someone who has the resources and the time to start their own group, even though we've tried to make it as easy as possible. I recognize that that's been a barrier. So that's one of the things we've been trying to do. We have a new organization called Nature Moves. And the idea is, how can we work with local governments to provide something that's free at the point of, users, so that money isn't a barrier and it's something that people can do in different environments. So it doesn't require you to live in a rural area near a woodland. Is there a way you can kind of get these ideas, this kind of social movement, this community engagement in a way that works in more highly, population dense areas or urban areas? And that's kind of what we're working with now to see, can you take this thing that's worked so well and can you try to implement it in other areas? And that's kind of what we're really going to focus on for next year.
Cool. That's exciting. And I think we're going to continue the conversation as well. So thanks so much for joining. It's been such a stimulating conversation and really enjoyed it.
Really enjoyed it. Thanks for letting me talk.
Hi, it's Callum. I really hope you enjoyed the episode. We are so grateful to the British Society of Lifestyle Medicine for their support in producing these podcasts. And we wholeheartedly share their vision of transforming healthcare and levelling health inequalities through lifestyle medicine. If you want to find out more, please head to bslm.org.uk. Although catering for healthcare professionals, this podcast is for everyone. If you enjoyed it, please share it. And we love hearing from you, so do reach out. Thanks for listening.